I am an extreme extrovert. That's how I've always been. I draw energy from people around me, and I love to meet new people on a regular basis. So much so, in fact, that now that I go to school and work from home, I sometimes just have to go to the mall and walk around big groups of people just to suck up all that energy. I compare myself to Magneto from the X-Men, who sucks up the power of other mutants. That's me, but with the energy of other human beings. And it gives me a lot of energy when I do that. Even as an extreme extrovert, though, I found it very difficult when I became a pastor's wife in mid-2010 because I suddenly was meeting so many new people, and on a very regular basis, a constant basis sometimes, as new people came to our church, as we mentored people or met with them for ministry purposes. Sometimes it could be really intimidating, and it caused a lot of anxiety because I was constantly meeting these people I knew nothing about and having to get to know them and be able to minister them. And that was with the goal of having a really deep relationship with them if they attended our church. And I am by no means, I haven't mastered this skill, but I did find that by finding out a lot of information about people as soon as possible after I met them, through sharing my own stories and asking questions and being open to listening, I could really make that process more comfortable and easier as I reduced my uncertainty about those people. And we all engage in these behaviors, not just in ministry, but in business, in friendships, in dating relationships. We're always finding out new information about others. It's just a basic human process. And while we don't give it much thought, there is a theory that's based on the process of uncertainty reduction. It is called uncertainty reduction theory, and it was founded in the 1970s by Charles Berger and his colleague Richard Calabrese, who were communication professors. And again, this has been really influential in the communication field, but it can be applied in many contexts, and I want to talk to you today about how uncertainty reduction theory applies to us in ministry. So I want to tell you a little bit about the theory itself and some of the major concepts of it. I want to talk about some of the research that's been conducted about this theory, and that's not just in ministry, it's in different contexts, but we can certainly see how it still applies to us. And then a little bit about the criticisms and general applications to us in ministry. So in this first work by Berger and Calabrese, it's called Some Explorations in Initial Interactions and Beyond Toward a Developmental Theory of Interpersonal Communication. That was written in 1975. And they proposed this theory, this uncertainty reduction theory. They identify several phases of uncertainty reduction in relationships. They talk about different uncertainty reducing strategies, and then they also outline some axioms and theorems, and I'm not going to delve into those today, but it is really interesting to look at the different results, the different ways that uncertainty reduction impacts your interpersonal relationships, and how each element influences the other elements. And you're welcome to read about that in the sources that I have cited for you at the end of the PowerPoint. But to examine the three phases that Berger and Calabrese discuss here, there's the entry phase, which is the very beginning of a relationship when you're just meeting someone and you don't know anything about them. There's the personal phase, which is also called the maintenance phase. This is relationship maintenance as the relationship continues. And sometimes there's also an exit phase. And this can occur if there's a divorce or something like that, if there's some kind of end to the relationship, but it doesn't always occur in all relationships. So putting this in our church context, let's say that there's a new visitor one week, and let's just say that his name is Tony. Tony walks in the door, and you're going to immediately be in the entry phase when you go over to talk to him. You go over, you shake his hand, introduce yourself, and start engaging in uncertainty reducing behaviors to find out more about him. Now, if Tony joined your church, then you would be engaging in relationship maintenance or personal behaviors in that phase, and you would be trying to find out information still, but on more of a slow, friendly kind of basis, where you're just continuing to build a friendship and a relationship with him. And then an exit phase could occur if Tony got really upset about something that happened at church, decided he didn't want to have anything to do with the church or with you, and he walks out the door. Those are the 3 phases that could occur, and hopefully you never get to that 3rd phase, but of course all of us in ministry know, unfortunately, that occurs more often than we would like it to. I actually had someone leave our church in a major hysteria fit because, well, 2 things I did. I drank coffee in the sanctuary sometimes, and I also offered candy at our church block parties, and this particular person thought I should be offering vegetables at this outreach event. So we just had a difference of opinion, but it caused a pretty big rift in that relationship. Now, there are different strategies that we engage in to reduce our uncertainty about other people. There's passive, which is mostly observation. There's active, which is an indirect communication where we go to other people who know someone who we're trying to get to know, and we ask questions to those people to find out information about the subject that we're trying to learn about. And then finally, there is the interactive strategy where you would go up and actually actively talk to someone to find out information about them. If we go back to our example of Tony, we could watch him before we go up and talk to him. As he comes into the church, you might see someone new there, and he goes over and grabs a cup of coffee and chats with a few people. You might notice his nonverbal behavior. You might notice the kind of people that he's attracted to in the church. And yes, this does sound a little stalkerish, but if we're honest, this is something we all really engage in. We like to people watch and just find out about them in that way. We could also take the active strategy route, and we could go up, and maybe someone invited Tony to church, and we could go up to those people and say, hey, tell me about Tony. What is he like? Has he lived here for very long? Is he looking for a church? We could find out information about him in that way. Or we could, of course, go directly up to Tony, as I mentioned before in the entry phase, and just start talking to him and asking questions. And if he says, well, I just moved to the area, you might self-disclose and say something like, oh yeah, I've been in the area for 3 years, and here's what I like, and here's what I don't like. And in that way, you start finding out information about Tony. And self-disclosure and questions play a big role in that, which we'll see in the literature review. So let's go ahead and just talk very quickly about the axioms and theorems. There are 7 axioms and 21 theorems, and again, I'm not going to delve into them, but just to give you an example of what they are, one of the axioms is that as uncertainty reduces, verbal communication will increase. So the more that you talk to someone, the less uncertainty there will be, and as you have even less uncertainty about someone, you'll actually talk more. So verbal communication just continues to increase while uncertainty decreases. And there are a lot of different elements here that they discuss, and there's also the 21 theorems that are quite in-depth. This is a very in-depth analysis of our communication, and even though this is a communication theory, it's useful for us to look at all of the details here to understand our own behaviors and the behaviors of other people, because the whole point of reducing uncertainty is so that we can understand and predict the behaviors of other people, and also understand and predict our own behaviors. So let's go ahead and look at the literature and the research about this theory. There was a woman named Kathy Kellerman who was a researcher and did research with Charles Berger about uncertainty reduction theory, and they found that they put up some students in a room, and they sent in other students and said to one group of students, go in there, talk to this person that you've never met before, and try to find out as much information as you can. And to another group of students, they sent them in and said, find out as little information as you can. Well, what they found was that students who wanted to find out a lot of information went in and asked a lot of open-ended questions, self-disclosed a lot of information, and really tried to fish around to find out about that other person. Whereas the students who went into the room with the goal of not learning about the other person used a lot of small talk, they talked about the weather, they didn't ask questions, and they didn't share personal information. And so we need to remember this as we go into interactions with new people in our ministry. for some of us this comes naturally, but for others it's kind of a challenge to put your information out there and to you might feel like you're prying if you're asking for other people's information, but you can see from the study that it was an effective strategy because those students did learn a lot more about the other person that they were trying to talk to. This theory has been overall pretty well supported in the U.S., and a lot of the findings have held up over multiple case studies, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that we are in a rapidly changing culture that is becoming more and more diverse. There are more nationalities over here in the United States than ever before. And so as a result of that, we need to be mindful that our uncertainty reducing strategies may not always work well with people of other nationalities. For example, there was a researcher named Gudekunst, and Gudekunst used a lot of uncertainty reduction theory in his studies and in his research, and he actually formed his own theory that was very similar to uncertainty reduction, which was called anxiety management theory. But Gudekunst went to people in the US, Korea, and Japan, and he tested uncertainty reduction. And what's been found in all of the cross-cultural studies about uncertainty reduction is that it does hold up some of the time, but it's not true all of the time because different cultures react in different ways in interpersonal relationships. So for example, Gudekunst looked in one study at job procurement, romantic relationships, and friendships in those three countries, the US, Korea, and Japan, and he found that a lot of the time the more collectivist cultures were less likely to self-disclose information and also to ask personal questions of other people. A similar study by California State University looked at Asian Americans and African Americans and Anglo Americans who were students in the US, and they asked them questionnaires about their own communication techniques and the communication of other people, and they found again that the collectivist, a lot of times it's the Asian cultures, they tend to self-disclose less and ask a lot less personal questions. Now interestingly, African Americans were the most likely to ask personal questions and self-disclose a lot of information, at least according to their own perceptions. And then of course, in the individualist society of the United States, we are in general very likely to engage in those behaviors to learn information about other people. One author, Goldsmith, stated that this theory has been studied extensively in China, Korea, Switzerland, and Germany, in addition to the US and Japan that we already mentioned. So once we look at cross-cultural communication, the last thing I want to discuss as far as the literature is computer-mediated communication. I'm sure a lot of your churches are connected via the web and social networks, and a lot of people are forming relationships, not just strengthening relationships, but forming relationships through social networking and online communication these days. In fact, one 2013 study stated that 1/3 of dating relationships start online, and a 2014 study stated that most people have at least 200 online friends, and a lot of those relationships started online. So one study in the Netherlands actually showed that people who were online used passive, interactive, and active strategies to get to know other people, but when they mostly used passive strategies, they didn't find out very much information. The same for active, but once they finally interacted with those people online, rather than just looking at their profile or their pictures, they finally found out much more information. Another study in 2010 called for a new strategy called warranting. They said it should be a 4th URT strategy, and this would be verifying information that people from online communication communicate and self-disclose. So if someone says, I went to Harvard, you might Google them and find out if they really went to Harvard. If someone comes to your church and tells you some kind of really crazy story, you might Google it to find out if it's true, and that's called warranting. Now this theory's faced some criticism, specifically from one researcher named Sunafranc, who said that personal relational goals was the main reason that we try to reduce uncertainty in relationships. this theory can be very helpful to you in your ministry. I know that it has been to me, and I hope that you gained from this presentation.